Nebraska Sandhills, January 1887. The wind cut through the sod walls like they weren't even there. Across the treeless plains, settlers huddled in their dugouts and sod houses, watching their firewood turn to frozen mush under drifting snow. Most folks stored their wood outside, stacked against the house, covered with canvas that the wind ripped away, or piled in open sheds that might as well have been sieves. But one widow was building something nobody understood. While her neighbors built up, she was digging down. While they added rooms above ground, she was carving space beneath her existing sod house. And when they asked why, she gave them a simple answer that made them laugh. The earth doesn't freeze 6 feet down. They thought she'd lost her mind. What they didn't know was that she'd just solved the problem that killed more pioneers than wolves ever did. Wet firewood in a land where fire meant survival. If you want to see how one desperate idea became the smartest survival hack in the Sandhills, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week, I bring you one real frontier technique that worked when lives depended on it. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know if you've ever dealt with a winter that tested everything you knew. Now let me show you what happened when necessity became invention. Her name was Esther Caulfield, 31 years old, widowed the previous spring when her husband took fever and didn't recover. She had 2 children, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6, and 80 acres of prairie that grew grass better than it grew hope. The sod house they lived in was standard for the region. Walls cut from prairie sod stacked like bricks, a roof of willow poles covered with more sod and canvas. It kept out most of the rain and some of the wind. In summer, it stayed relatively cool. In winter, it was a different story. The real problem wasn't the cold outside. The real problem was keeping wood dry enough to burn. In the Sandhills, timber was scarce. What little firewood existed had to be hauled from creek bottoms or traded at brutal prices. Every stick mattered. And when the January snows came, wet, heavy, driven sideways by winds that never seemed to stop, that precious firewood got soaked. Wet wood doesn't burn. It smolders. It fills your house with smoke and gives you almost no heat. You can freeze to death with a pile of firewood right outside your door. Esther had watched this happen the previous winter. She'd watched her husband chip ice off frozen logs, trying to split them with numb fingers. She'd watched him burn through twice the wood they should have needed because half of it was too wet to catch properly. She wasn't going to do that again. The idea came to her not as a flash of genius, but as a desperate calculation. Her sod house sat on a slight rise, barely noticeable, but enough that the south side had exposed earth beneath the floor joists. The ground there stayed relatively dry, protected by the overhang of the house itself. What she went deeper. She started digging in late November before the ground froze solid. Not a root cellar. Those were common enough. She was digging a room, a space large enough to store firewood, protected not just from snow and rain, but insulated by the earth itself. The concept was simple, almost primitive. Create a dugout chamber directly beneath the southern edge of her house, accessible through a short tunnel that would stay covered and protected. The earth 6 feet down held a steady temperature, around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, even in the dead of winter. Cold by human comfort, but far warmer than the air above ground, and more importantly, dry. She excavated roughly 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 7 feet deep. The walls were bare earth, packed hard. She shored the ceiling with salvaged timber from an abandoned claim 3 miles east, what her husband had planned to use for a barn that would never be built. She created a sloped entrance tunnel, just wide enough to pass through with an armload of wood, angled downward from a trap door cut into her floor. It looked insane. From the outside, there was no indication anything had changed. But inside her house, that trap door in the corner looked like a mouth opening into darkness. And to anyone who saw it, it looked like a woman digging her own grave. The first person to see it was her nearest neighbor, a man named Garrett Thorne, who lived 1.5 miles west. He'd stopped by to check on her in early December, the kind of welfare visit that frontier neighbors made because isolation could kill as surely as cold. When Esther showed him what she'd done, he stared at the trapdoor for a long moment. "That's a hole in your floor," he said. "It's storage," she replied. "It's a grave waiting to happen. That ceiling's going to collapse." Or you're going to get water seeping in and turn the whole thing into a mud pit. Or carbon dioxide's going to pool down there and suffocate you when you climb down. She'd thought about the ventilation. She'd cut a narrow shaft that vented near ground level outside, screened with scrap metal to keep animals out. But Garrett wasn't interested in her solutions. Esther, I'm saying this because your husband was a decent man and he'd want someone to talk sense into you. It's not right. It's not how people build. Word spread quickly. In a region where homesteads were measured in miles apart, gossip traveled at the speed of concern and boredom. By mid-December, Esther's whole house was the talk of the district. Milton Frazier, a carpenter who'd built half the claimed shanties within 30 miles, made the trip out specifically to see it. He was a man whose opinion carried weight. If Frazier said a structure was sound, people believed him. If he said it was foolish, people listened. He descended into the dugout storage room, examined the timber bracing, ran his hand along the packed earth walls. When he emerged, his expression was set. Ma'am, I understand you're in a hard position, but this is a waste of effort and a genuine danger. Earth walls need to be sealed or they'll crumble. That timber you're using isn't treated. It'll rot out in 2 seasons, maybe less with the moisture down there. And you're creating a cold trap. Cold air sinks. You're basically building an icebox under your house. Esther didn't argue. She just nodded and thanked him for his time. The women were less technical, but more cutting. At the church gathering in Maplewood, a settlement that was really just 4 buildings and a dream, Esther overheard Clara Donnelly, a woman whose husband owned a successful freight business. It's unseemly, Clara said, not bothering to lower her voice much. Living like a prairie dog. What kind of home is that for children? Next she'll be sleeping in it. Another woman, whose name Esther didn't catch, laughed. Maybe she's preparing for the end times. Or maybe she's just lost her sense along with her husband. Esther kept stacking firewood in her underground room. Every piece she carried down those earthen steps was one more piece that wouldn't get buried in snow. One more piece that wouldn't freeze into an unusable block. One more piece that would actually burn when she needed it to. She didn't need them to understand. She needed her children to stay warm. The storm arrived on January 9th, 1887. It started as a temperature drop, nothing unusual for Nebraska winter. But by midday, the wind had shifted to the northwest, and the sky had turned the color of old iron. By evening, snow was falling horizontally, driven by winds that screamed across the plains with nothing to stop them. This wasn't a normal winter storm. This was a blizzard that would later be called the school children's storm, because it caught so many young people away from home, in one-room schoolhouses or walking back from town. Across the region, people froze to death within sight of their own doors, blinded and disoriented by wind and snow. For the homesteaders in their sod houses, survival came down to one thing. Could you keep a fire burning? Esther's neighbors faced the same problem they faced every hard winter, but worse. The snow didn't just fall, it drove into every crack, every gap, every poorly covered wood pile. Canvas covers ripped away. Sheds built above ground offered no protection against snow that came from every direction at once. A quarter-mile north, the Brennan family burned through their dry kindling in the first 6 hours, then spent the next 2 days trying to coax flame from wood that was half frozen, half soaked. Their house filled with smoke. The fire would catch, burn weakly, then die. They'd restart it, burn more kindling, watch it die again. By the second day, they were burning furniture. Garrett Thorne, the neighbor who'd warned Esther about cave-ins, had his woodpile buried under 4 feet of drift. He spent 3 hours digging it out, only to find the bottom layers had wicked up moisture from the ground and frozen solid. He had to bring the wood inside and let it thaw before he could even attempt to split it. Wet wood, smoke, miserable heat that barely kept the room above freezing. Milton Frazier, the carpenter, fared better. His shed was well built and his wood was stacked properly on pallets. But even his supply took on moisture. The temperature inside his house hovered in the low 40s. Livable, but brutal. Esther's situation was different. Every morning, she descended through the trapdoor, carrying an empty sack. Every morning, she came back up with wood that was bone dry, at a comfortable temperature, ready to burn. Her fire caught immediately. It burned hot and clean. The difference between her house and her neighbors wasn't subtle. It was stark. Stay with me, because the number I'm about to show you silenced every critic in the county. The blizzard lasted 4 days. When it finally broke on January 13th, the landscape was transformed. Drifts 15 feet high, houses buried to their roof lines, and a community taking stock of what it had cost them in fuel, in effort, in frozen fingers and smoke-filled lungs. That's when people started doing the math. Garrett Thorne was the first to ask the question directly. He showed up at Esther's door on January 15th, 2 days after the storm cleared. The drifts were still chest-high in places, but the wind had died and the sun was out. That brutal bright sun that makes snow blindness a real danger. "How much wood did you burn?" he asked without preamble. Esther considered. "Maybe a third of what I usually go through in 4 days." Garrett shook his head. "That's not possible. I burned everything I had plus a chair and part of a table. You're telling me you kept warm on a third of your normal usage." "The wood was dry," she said simply. "Dry wood burns hotter and longer." He asked to see the dugout storage. When Esther lifted the trapdoor and led him down the earthen steps, he stopped halfway and just stood there. The air was still, quiet, and noticeably warmer than the air above ground. "What's the temperature down here?" he asked. "I don't have a thermometer," Esther admitted. "But it's warm enough that frost doesn't form. Warm enough that wood doesn't freeze." Garrett walked to the far wall, ran his hand over a stack of split oak. The wood was dry to the touch. Not warm, but not cold either. Room temperature. Storage temperature. Perfect burning temperature. He picked up a piece and examined it. No ice crystals. No surface moisture. Just seasoned wood, ready to light. "I burned wet wood for 4 days," he said quietly. "Fought with it every hour. Smoke everywhere. Kids coughing. And you just walked down here and grabbed dry wood whenever you needed it." "That's about right," Esther said. The story spread, but this time it wasn't gossip. It was data. Milton Frazier, the skeptical carpenter, came to verify the claims himself. He brought a thermometer. At ground level, the outside air temperature was 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside Esther's main house, with a fire burning, 61 degrees. Inside the dugout storage room, 52 degrees. That 52-degree reading was the number that changed everything. Think about what that meant in practical terms. While the outside air was cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, the earth-insulated storage room maintained a temperature 41 degrees warmer. Wood stored there never froze, never accumulated frost, never absorbed atmospheric moisture from snow or rain. Frazier did a rough calculation based on Esther's reported wood consumption. During the 4-day blizzard, she'd burned approximately 12 to 15 pieces of firewood per day, about 50 pieces total. Her neighbors, fighting with wet or frozen wood, had burned anywhere from 80 to over 120 pieces in the same period, and still maintained lower interior temperatures. The math was undeniable. Esther had used roughly half the fuel to maintain better heat. But the real proof went beyond numbers. It was visible in the details. When neighbors visited, they saw her children playing comfortably near the fire, not huddled in blankets. They saw a house without the sour smell of smoldering wet wood. They saw a woman who wasn't exhausted from fighting with her fuel supply every waking hour. The dugout storage room had done exactly what she'd intended. It had created a stable, protected environment where firewood could be stored at a consistent temperature, shielded from precipitation, wind, and freeze-thaw cycles that made wood nearly unusable. Clara Donnelly, the woman who'd called it unseemly, came by in late January. She didn't apologize, but she did ask detailed questions about the excavation process, the timber bracing, and the ventilation shaft. She was taking notes. By February, 3 families within 5 miles were digging similar storage rooms beneath or adjacent to their sod houses. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen because Esther promoted her idea. She never stood up at a community gathering and explained her method. She never wrote instructions or invited people to inspect her work. The technique spread the way most frontier innovations spread, through desperation, observation, and the simple fact that survival doesn't care about pride. Garrett Thorne was the first to adapt the concept, but he did it his own way. Instead of digging beneath his existing house, he excavated a storage chamber into the south-facing hillside about 20 feet from his main door. He created a tunnel entrance at ground level, sloping downward into a room roughly the same size as Esther's. The principle was identical. Use the Earth's stable temperature to protect firewood from moisture and freezing. He finished it in late February 1887, just in time for a late-season storm that dumped another 18 inches of snow. While his neighbors scrambled to keep their above-ground wood piles accessible, Garrett simply walked into his hillside storage and carried out dry wood. The next morning, he had visitors. By March, 2 more families had started similar projects. The Kellerman family, who lived on a flat section with no hillside to dig into, did what Esther had done. They excavated directly beneath the floor of their sod house, creating a trapdoor access in their main room. The Pruitt family built a partially underground shed, with walls extending 4 feet below grade and a sod-covered roof at ground level. Each adaptation was different, tailored to the specific terrain and resources available. But the core idea remained the same. Move your firewood storage below the frost line into the stable temperature zone where the earth itself becomes insulation. Milton Fraser, the carpenter who'd initially dismissed Esther's dugout as dangerous and impractical, became one of its most vocal advocates, though he never quite admitted he'd been wrong. Instead, he reframed it as a refinement. The concept is sound if you do it properly, he told people. You need proper timber bracing, adequate ventilation, and drainage consideration. But yes, earth-sheltered storage makes sense for this climate. He started offering his services to help families design and build their own versions. By the end of 1887, he'd supervised the construction of 11 earth-sheltered storage rooms within a 30-mile radius. The technique wasn't just spreading locally. Travelers passing through the region noticed the unusual structures, trapdoors and floors, hillside entrances, partially buried sheds. They asked questions. They carried the idea with them to other settlements. A freighter named Coleman Birch, who ran supply routes between the sandhills and the rail towns to the south, saw Esther's setup in April 1887. By June, he mentioned it to homesteaders in 3 different counties. By autumn, variations of earth-sheltered firewood storage were appearing in regions 50 miles away. What started as one widow's desperate solution had become standard practice. The innovation worked because it addressed a specific, life-threatening problem with a solution that required minimal resources. You didn't need special tools. You didn't need expensive materials. You needed a shovel, some salvaged timber, and the willingness to dig. For people living on the edge of survival, that was enough. By the winter of 1888 to 89, the technique had evolved further. Some families were storing more than just firewood in their earth-sheltered spaces. Root vegetables, seed grain, anything that needed protection from temperature extremes but didn't require warm storage. The social consequence was subtler, but just as significant. Esther Caulfield had gone from being the subject of ridicule to being someone people consulted. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but when neighbors had questions about excavation depth, ventilation, or timber bracing, they came to her. She never charged for advice. She never acted like an expert. She just told people what had worked for her and what hadn't. Clara Donnelly, the woman who'd called it unseemly, never apologized directly. But in the spring of 1888, she showed up at Esther's door with a basket of early greens and a loaf of bread. "For your help with our storage room," she said, awkward but sincere. It made a difference this winter. Esther accepted the basket. "I'm glad it worked for you." That was all that needed to be said. By 1890, earth-sheltered storage rooms were common enough in the sandhills that new settlers arriving in the region learned about them as part of the standard advice for surviving the climate. The technique wasn't attributed to any one person. It had become part of the collective knowledge of the place. One more adaptation that separated people who thrived from people who merely endured. Esther's children grew up. Her son became a builder, and he incorporated earth-shelter design into every structure he worked on. Her daughter married a homesteader 40 miles north and built her own dugout storage room before her first winter. The idea had become legacy, not because anyone remembered Esther's name in connection with it. Most people didn't. but because the solution worked, and in frontier life, what worked survived. There's a pattern in frontier history that we miss when we romanticize it. We imagine rugged individuals conquering nature through sheer determination. We picture log cabins and stone hearths, and people who simply toughed it out. The reality was different. The people who survived, really survived, not just limped through winters half-starved and frostbitten, were the ones who worked with their environment instead of against it. They were the ones who observed, adapted, and weren't too proud to try something that looked strange. Esther Caulfield's dugout storage room wasn't revolutionary technology. It was basic physics applied to a specific problem. The Earth maintains a relatively stable temperature below the frost line. In the sandhills of Nebraska, that frost line sits about 4 feet deep. Go deeper than that, and you enter a zone where temperature fluctuates far less than the air above. At 6 to 8 feet deep, the Earth holds steady around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Cold enough that you wouldn't want to live there, but warm enough that water doesn't freeze and doesn't accumulate frost. Dry enough that properly stored firewood stays ready to burn. This wasn't secret knowledge. People have been building root cellars using the same principle for centuries, but applying it to firewood storage, making it a primary survival strategy rather than a secondary convenience. That connection took someone who was desperate enough to ignore what looked right and focus on what would actually work. The lesson isn't about digging holes. The lesson is about problem-solving under constraints. Esther didn't have money for a fancy wood shed with a shingled roof and raised floor. She didn't have a husband to help with heavy construction. She didn't have the social capital to ignore criticism. What she had was a shovel, salvaged timber, and the clarity that comes from knowing your children's survival depends on you solving one specific problem: keeping firewood dry enough to burn. So she dug down instead of building up. She used the earth as insulation instead of fighting it as an enemy. She created a solution that cost almost nothing in materials, but saved everything in fuel efficiency. The modern world has mostly forgotten this kind of thinking. We solve problems by adding complexity, better materials, more insulation, sophisticated heating systems, backup generators. Those solutions work, but they require resources that most people throughout history didn't have. What Esther understood, and what her neighbors eventually learned, was that sometimes the best solution isn't the most impressive one. Sometimes it's the one that works with what you have and what your environment provides. The Earth's stable temperature isn't a modern discovery. It's not a life hack. It's just physics that's been there the entire time, waiting for someone desperate or clever enough to use it. By the early 1900s, as homesteading shifted and new building techniques arrived with the railroad, many of these earth-sheltered storage rooms were abandoned or filled in. Newer settlers built frame houses with proper lumber. They had better access to coal and eventually to other fuel sources. The desperate innovations of the 1880s looked primitive, unnecessary. But in some places, the knowledge persisted. In some families, the practice continued. Because once you've burned dry wood all winter while your neighbors fought with frozen logs, you don't forget the difference it makes. Today, if you drive through the sandhills, and there's not much reason to unless you're specifically looking for history, you can still find traces. Depressions in the earth where storage rooms once existed. Remnants of timber bracing. Stone-lined entrances that lead nowhere now. Most people drive past without noticing. But if you know what you're looking at, you're seeing evidence of a moment when someone refused to accept that survival had to be miserable and found a better way. Not through technology, not through wealth, just through observation, effort, and the willingness to dig a hole that everybody else thought was crazy. So here's my question for you. Where are you watching this from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever had to deal with? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and I want to hear your stories. Because the principles that kept Esther Caulfield's family warm in 1887 still matter today, whether you're off-grid in Alaska or just trying to cut your heating bill in Ohio. And if you got value from this story, if you learned something, or if it made you think differently about old solutions to modern problems, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Every week, I bring you real frontier techniques that worked when everything was on the line. This was wisdom that survived because it worked. Don't let it disappear. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.